For your cab home. Daniel's covering mine. Keep the dollar. The review has already begun.
The billionaire's mistress threw $1 in his wife's face. Seconds later, her bank account froze. Hook. That dollar is going to cost you everything you own. But go ahead. Pick it up off the floor and find out. Pre-story summary: Claire Whitmore had spent 2 years being the wife nobody looked at twice. Quiet at charity galas, gracious at board dinners. Always standing just slightly to the left of her husband Daniel, close enough to look like a partnership, far enough that nobody thought to ask her opinion. What nobody knew was that Claire had spent those same 2 years building something. Something legal, something airtight, something her father had started and she had finished. The night Vanessa Cole dropped a dollar bill at Claire's feet in front of 200 people, she thought she was ending a marriage. She was actually pulling a pin. Chapter 1: The Dollar and the Woman Who Was Ready. The rooftop of the Whitmore Capitol building sat 43 floors above Midtown Manhattan. On a clear October evening, it looked like something out of a magazine. String lights threaded through potted olive trees, white linen on round tables, the skyline doing what it always did, which was make everyone feel like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The Whitmore Capitol Annual Charity Gala had been held here every October for 11 years. Claire had attended every single one. She was standing near the east railing with a glass of champagne she had not touched, watching the city the way she had learned to watch rooms, quietly, taking in more than she let on. She had on a dark navy dress, simple cut, no statement jewelry. She did not need it. She was 41 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that the women who commanded the most attention in rooms like this were never the ones trying hardest to get it. Daniel was across the room. She knew exactly where he was without looking. 14 years of marriage gave you that. A kind of peripheral awareness of another person that did not require eye contact or proximity. He was near the bar, talking to 2 men from the hedge fund world, laughing at something. His hand moving in that particular way it moved when he was performing easy confidence rather than feeling it. She knew that gesture. She knew all his gestures. That was the strange cruelty of a marriage going wrong. You did not stop knowing the person. You just stopped being able to do anything with what you knew. Vanessa Cole had arrived 40 minutes after the gala started, which was exactly the kind of entrance that announced it itself. She was 34, dark-haired, and dressed in a way that understood the assignment completely. Elegant enough for the room, just slightly too much for a charity event. Claire had seen her at 2 functions before this one. Both times, Daniel had made a point of not looking at her too deliberately, which was its own kind of tell. Claire watched Vanessa move through the room. She watched the way people responded, the men slightly more attentive, the women slightly more careful. Vanessa was good at working a room. Claire would give her that. She had been tracking the evening with a kind of patience that had nothing to do with resignation. She had her phone in her small clutch. She knew what was on it. She had known for 3 weeks what this evening might become, and she had made certain decisions accordingly. What she had not fully anticipated was how casual it would feel when it finally happened. Vanessa separated from a conversation near the center of the terrace. She started walking toward Claire. Not toward the bar, not toward another cluster of guests, specifically and deliberately, with the steady pace of someone who had decided something and was done deliberating. The nearest table went quiet. 8 people, most of them Whitmore Capitol board members and their spouses. Going quiet in that particular way, that meant they were absolutely paying attention while pretending otherwise. Vanessa stopped 2 feet away. She reached into her small evening bag. She pulled out a single dollar bill, and she held it for just a moment, long enough for the gesture to register. Then she dropped it on the polished concrete floor between them. "For your cab home," Vanessa said. Her voice was even, almost pleasant. "Daniel is covering mine." The words landed in the silence, like a stone into still water. Claire looked at the dollar on the floor. She looked at it for exactly the amount of time it took her to decide she was not going to pick it up. Then she looked up at Vanessa, and her expression did not do any of the things Vanessa was expecting. It did not crumple. It did not flush. It did not arrange itself into the particular misery of a woman publicly humiliated. What it did was something quieter and considerably more dangerous, though Vanessa would not have been able to name it in that moment. "I appreciate the thought," Claire said. Then, over Vanessa's shoulder, she found the person she was looking for. Marcus Webb was standing near the elevator bank, maybe 60 feet away, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, his phone face down against his palm. He was 63 years old, and he had the kind of stillness that came from decades of knowing exactly when to move and when not to. He had been her father's attorney for 22 years. He had been Claire's attorney for 8 months. He was the only other person on this rooftop who knew what the next 30 seconds were going to set in motion. He glanced up. Their eyes met. Claire gave the smallest nod, a tilt of her chin that no one else would have registered as meaningful. Marcus's thumb moved once against his phone screen, and that was it. That was all it took. The mechanism that Claire and Marcus had spent 8 months constructing, the legal architecture built on a foundation her father had laid before he died, the clause buried inside a shareholder agreement that nobody had ever thought to read carefully, because nobody had ever imagined a reason to, all of it activated with a single file document. Time-stamped 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in October, 43 floors above Midtown Manhattan. Claire set her untouched champagne on the tray of a passing waiter. She picked up her clutch. She turned to go. Vanessa's voice came from behind her. There was something in it now, not quite uncertainty, but the first edge of it. "You're just leaving?" Claire paused. She did not turn around fully, just enough to be heard clearly. "I already did what I came here to do," she said. She walked to the elevator. Marcus fell into step beside her without a word. The doors opened. They stepped inside. The last thing Claire saw before the doors closed was Daniel, standing at the edge of the bar, completely still, his drink forgotten in his hand. He had watched the whole thing, every second of it, and he had not moved. That was the moment she lost him. Not the dollar, not the words, not any of what Vanessa had done. It was his stillness. 14 years, and when it mattered, he had stood there and let it happen. She turned to face the elevator doors as they closed, and she let herself feel that for exactly the length of time it took to reach the lobby. Then she put it somewhere she could deal with later, and she thought about what came next. In the elevator, Marcus kept his eyes on the numbers descending. "It's filed," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "The clause activates automatically once the affidavit hits the system. Accounts tied to any unauthorized third-party recipients of corporate funds, they'll see it within the hour." Claire nodded. She already knew this. They had been over it many times. Her retainer from the subsidiary, she said, shows up as a consulting fee, 14 months of payments. She thought it was buried deep enough. Marcus permitted himself a small, dry expression that was not quite a smile. The lobby doors opened. The night air came in cold and clear from the street. A car was already waiting. Marcus had arranged it 3 days ago, because that was the kind of attorney he was. "And Daniel?" she asked. Marcus considered his answer. "He doesn't know about the trust. Not yet. He's going to find out in a way he's not going to enjoy." Claire got into the car. She looked out the window at the building they had just left. Glass and steel and light against the dark sky. the building that bore her husband's family name, but had been majority-controlled for 7 years by a trust in her name. A trust her father had structured with a precision that bordered on prophecy, because Edward Ashworth had been a corporate attorney for 35 years, and he had understood certain things about power and certain things about his daughter's husband, long before Claire had been willing to see them clearly. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus, sent from the car beside her. Confirmed. Clock started. She put her phone in her clutch and looked out the window and watched the city move past. She had hoped for a very long time that this night would never come. She had hoped that she was wrong about Daniel, wrong about Vanessa, wrong about what the marriage had become. She had constructed the legal architecture not because she wanted to use it, but because her father had raised her to understand that hope without preparation is just wishing. She had prepared, and she had hoped, and Daniel had stood at that bar and not moved. The car moved uptown through the glittering dark, and Claire Whitmore sat in the back seat and allowed herself, very quietly, to grieve the marriage she had not quite been able to save. Chapter 2: What a Quiet Woman Builds. Claire woke at 5:40 the next morning without an alarm. This was not unusual. She had been waking before dawn for most of her adult life, a habit inherited from her father, who believed that the early hours belonged to people who had real things to think about. She lay still for a moment in the large bed. Daniel sighed undisturbed, the pillow flat, the duvet unbroken. She took inventory. She noted what she felt. She did not amplify it, and she did not suppress it. She just let it be there, the way you let weather be weather. What she felt this morning was a quiet, specific kind of sorrow, different from the raw grief of the previous night. Last night in the car had been about Daniel standing still. This morning was about waking up in a room where his absence had stopped being surprising. There was a difference between those two things. She understood the difference precisely, and she allowed herself about 4 minutes to sit inside it before she got up. She made coffee in the kitchen of the apartment that bore both their names on the deed, and had never quite felt like home to either of them. They had bought it 6 years ago, because it made sense for the life they were supposed to be building. Not because either of them had walked in and felt something loosen in their chest the way you feel it when a place is right. It was beautiful in the way that many things Daniel chose were beautiful. Correct, impressive, and slightly cold. She drank her coffee standing at the window. Looking out at the park below, the city was just beginning to wake up. That gray-gold light of early Manhattan morning, when the streets are not quite empty anymore, but have not yet committed to the day. She had always loved this hour. It was the one time the city felt like it belonged to the people who actually lived in it. Her phone had been on the kitchen counter since she came home, face up. There were 4 missed calls from Daniel, 2 texts. She had read the texts before she went to sleep. The first one, sent at 10:14 the previous night. Claire, call me. The second one, sent at 12:41 in the morning. We need to talk about what happened tonight. Where are you? No question mark on that last sentence. That was very Daniel. Not quite commanding, not quite asking. Hovering in the space between the two where he had lived for most of their marriage, assuming she would respond to the gravity of his need the way she always had. She had set the phone face up on the counter and gone to bed. She did not call him back this morning. This, too, was new. At 8 o'clock, she put on a coat and took a car to a building on the 42nd floor of which sat the offices of Webb, Ashworth and Associates, the firm her father had founded 30 years ago. He was a tall man with silver hair, and the kind of quiet authority that never needed a raised voice to make itself felt. He had known Claire since she was 17 years old. He had watched her grow up. He had watched her marry Daniel Whitmore with the careful neutrality of a man who had opinions, but understood it was not his place to offer them uninvited. He had watched the marriage drift in the direction it had drifted, and he had said nothing, until Claire had come to him 8 months ago and sat in the chair she was sitting in now and said very calmly, "I need to understand exactly what my father left me and exactly what I can do with it." That meeting had lasted 4 hours. This one started with a piece of information Marcus delivered before she had even finished settling into her chair. "Her attorney filed a response this morning," he said. He set a document on the desk between them. Maybe 12 pages, dense with legal language. They're arguing the clause activation is procedurally invalid. Claire set down her coffee. "On what grounds? That you never formally disclosed your ownership position to Daniel during the marriage. Their argument is that the shareholder agreement's spousal conduct clause cannot be triggered unilaterally by an owner who has maintained a deliberate concealment of their ownership status." Marcus said this with the careful precision of a man presenting information he personally found unimpressive but was professionally obligated to take seriously. "Is it a real argument?" Claire asked. "It's a real argument in the way that a check engine light is real," Marcus said. "It tells you something needs attention, but it doesn't mean the car is about to stop." He leaned back in his chair. "Your father anticipated this specific challenge. There's a disclosure provision in the trust documentation that was served to Daniel's attorneys at the time of your marriage. He received it. His attorneys received it. The fact that Daniel apparently never read it carefully enough to understand what it said is not the same as not being told." "He never asked about the trust," Claire said. "No, he didn't." Marcus's tone didn't change, but something in it settled. That's rather the point. She understood what he was not saying. Daniel had looked at the trust documentation 8 years ago at the time of the wedding, and he had seen the numbers and the structure and the name of the firm, and decided it was a wedding formality. A rich woman's father making sure his daughter had something in her own name, the kind of thing old money families did. He had not read it carefully enough to understand that the trust held a majority position in the company that bore his name. He had not asked, because asking would have required him to admit he did not know, and Daniel Whitmore had built his entire identity on always being the one in the room who knew. "What do we do about the response?" Claire asked. "We file a counter within 48 hours. I've already drafted it." He pushed a second document toward her. "I need your signature on 2 places and your initials on the disclosure exhibit." She read through it. Marcus sat quietly while she did. He had never been the kind of attorney who summarized documents for clients as though they could not read, which was one of several reasons she had trusted him her whole life. She read every page. She initialed what needed initialing. She signed where he indicated. When she was done, she set the pen down and looked at him. "How is she funding the legal response?" Claire asked. "Vanessa." Her accounts were frozen. Personal accounts were not touched, only the accounts connected to the subsidiary retainer. "She has her own resources." He considered for a moment, "and she may have other support." "The PE firm," Claire said. "That would be my assumption, yes." This was the thing Claire had known for 3 months. The private equity firm, Crestfield Partners. That had been quietly circling Whitmore Capital for the better part of a year. She had first heard the name from a Whitmore Capital board member, not Richard Hale, but a younger one, a woman named Sandra Park, who had pulled Claire aside at a lunch 5 months ago and said, very quietly, "Someone is asking questions about the company's capital structure that shouldn't be public knowledge. I thought you should know." Sandra Park was one of 3 board members who knew the full extent of Claire's ownership position. She was also one of 3 board members who had been close friends with Edward Ashworth. Claire trusted her father's judgment in people even more than she trusted her own. Crestfield has been building a position, Claire told Marcus. Not in Whitmore Capital directly. They know they can't get there without going through the trust. But they've been acquiring minority stakes in 3 of the subsidiary entities. If they get enough of the subsidiaries, Marcus said slowly, they can argue for a restructuring that forces a valuation of the parent company. How long have you known this? 3 months, Sandra told me. I've had our analysts tracking the subsidiary ownership transfers since then, and Vanessa is connected to Crestfield. She worked there for 2 years before she met Daniel. Her contact there, a man named Preston Hall, has been running the acquisition strategy. The affair gave her access to Daniel's calendar, his meeting schedules, his strategic planning sessions. She's been feeding information to Preston for at least a year, probably longer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was rearranging what he thought he knew. This isn't just a domestic dispute, he said finally. It never was, Claire said. It's a corporate play that used a domestic situation as cover, and when I triggered the clause last night, I didn't just freeze one account. I made Crestfield's entire subsidiary's acquisition strategy visible in the Whitmore Capital compliance system, because every payment Vanessa received from that subsidiary is now a matter of record in an active legal proceeding. Marcus looked at her with an expression she had seen on his face very few times in 24 years. Genuine, undisguised respect. Your father, he said, would have found this extremely satisfying. My father designed the mechanism, Claire said. I just learned how to use it. She meant it, genuinely. Edward Ashworth had not been a sentimental man, he had been a precise one, and he had loved his daughter with the particular fierceness of a person who expresses love through preparation. He had built the trust when Claire was 32 and just engaged, and he had said to her over dinner in his kitchen in Connecticut, the night after she'd told him about Daniel's proposal, I like Daniel. I want to be clear about that, but I've been practicing corporate law for 30 years, and I've seen what happens to people who confuse love with security. I want you to have both. I want you to have them separately, so that losing one never means losing the other. He had died 4 years later of a cardiac event, very suddenly. On a Tuesday morning in his office, he had been 66 years old. She had carried his voice inside her every day since. She thought about him a great deal in the 8 months she had spent with Marcus, understanding what he had built for her, deciding what to do with it. She thought about him on the morning she almost called Daniel and told him everything, because some part of her had always believed that the right kind of honesty could still fix the wrong kind of marriage. She thought about him on the night she wrote a text to Daniel that she never sent, typed it out fully, sat with it for 10 minutes, then deleted it. The text had said, I know about Vanessa. I know about all of it. Come home tonight and I will burn every document Marcus is holding. Just come home. She had not sent it. Daniel had not come home that night, not because he knew about the text, but because he had simply chosen not to be there, which told her everything the text would have needed to know. She had wanted to send it. That was the honest thing. She had wanted to send it and have him come through the door and tell her she was the one he chose. She had wanted it the way you want something when you already know, somewhere below the level of words, that you are not going to get it. She signed the last document and slid it back across Marcus's desk. And she allowed herself, for just a moment, to miss her father in a way that was not grief exactly, but something quieter than that, the knowledge that the right people, when they are gone, leave behind more than memory. They leave behind the work they did on your behalf, quietly, before you even knew you would need it. What's our timeline? She asked. The counterfiling gives us a strong position for the next 30 days. Crestfield will have to disclose their subsidiary positions in the compliance review. They won't want that. There's a reasonable chance they encourage Vanessa to settle rather than continue the litigation. But I want to be honest with you. The next few weeks are going to be uncomfortable. Daniel's attorneys will be involved. He's going to learn things he didn't know. I know, she said. Are you ready for that? She thought about the flat pillow on his side of the bed. She thought about 4 missed calls and 2 texts with no question marks. She thought about a man standing at a bar watching his wife be humiliated and not moving. I've been ready for a while, she said. I just kept hoping I wouldn't have to be. She gathered her coat and her bag. At the door, she paused. Marcus, has Vanessa looked into you as an attorney? Has she tried to research your connection to me? He considered this. There's been some activity around the firm's public records. Someone pulled our client history 3 days ago through a third-party search service. She found your name associated with the firm, obviously. What she won't have found is the specific nature of the trust documentation, because that's sealed. But she knows we have a relationship, Claire said. Claire nodded slowly. Then she knows something is coming. She just doesn't know what. That, Marcus said, with the dry precision that was the closest he usually got to warmth, is exactly how your father would have wanted it. 3 blocks north, in a hotel suite that Daniel was paying for, Vanessa Cole was on the phone with Preston Hall, and the conversation was not going well. The compliance review is going to expose the subsidiary payments, he said. His voice had lost the smoothness it usually carried. All of them, 14 months of transfers. If that goes into a public legal proceeding, Crestfield's whole position becomes visible. You said it was untraceable, Vanessa said. I said it was buried. There's a difference. A pause on his end. We need to talk about our options. We can settle. We offer Claire Whitmore a clean dissolution. She drops the clause activation. We pull the legal challenge. Everyone walks away quietly. Vanessa stood at the window of the hotel suite, looking out at midday Manhattan, and felt the first real chill of something she recognized as fear. Not because settling was the worst option, but because settling meant admitting that she had walked into that gala and dropped a dollar bill at Claire's feet and started a clock she had not even known was running. She planned this, Vanessa said. Not a question. The affidavit was filed 47 seconds after the incident, Preston said. She didn't plan it that night. She planned it months ago. Vanessa didn't say anything for a moment. She was thinking about something that had nagged at her for a long time. The fact that Claire Whitmore never seemed worried about money, not in the way that women in her position usually weren't worried, meaning they had a wealthy husband who handled it, but in a different way, a quieter way, like someone who knew the floor was solid because they had checked it themselves. She knew about me, Vanessa said. She knew, and she waited. Then she's smarter than Daniel thinks she is. Smarter than I thought she was. Preston's voice came back flat and without comfort. Start thinking about what you're willing to give up to make this go away. Because she isn't. Chapter 3, The Man Who Misread Everything. Daniel Whitmore had built things before. That was the fact he returned to when everything else felt uncertain. And it had served him well for a long time as a kind of personal bedrock. He had built Whitmore Capital from a mid-sized family firm that was technically solvent, but spiritually exhausted, into something that appeared in financial publications and attracted the kind of institutional investors who had options. He had done this between the ages of 26 and 38. In the years after his father's indictment had stripped the family name of whatever insulation old money provides, and left Daniel with a choice between inheriting the wreckage or building something new on top of it. He had chosen to build. That choice had defined him. What he had not fully reckoned with was the particular blindness that comes from spending 15 years being the person who builds. You start to see everything as material. You start to assess rather than feel. You start to look at the people closest to you and see their function in the structure rather than their actual presence in your life. And you do this so gradually, and the returns are so consistently good that you don't notice what you've stopped seeing, until something makes the absence impossible to ignore. He had tried to call Claire 6 times since Tuesday night. She had not answered. This had never happened before in 14 years of marriage, and the fact of it sat in his chest like a foreign object, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, not yet fully understood. He was in his office on the 38th floor of the Whitmore Capitol building on Thursday morning, when his assistant knocked and said Richard Hale was asking to see him. Not a scheduled meeting. Richard Hale was 71 years old. He had been on the Whitmore Capitol Board for 9 years. Appointed during the period when Daniel had been rebuilding the firm and needed the credibility that came from attaching names like Hale's to the letterhead, he was a man of the old New York school, unhurried, precise, and constitutionally averse to dropping by unannounced. Daniel told his assistant to send him in. Richard came in with the deliberate unhurry of a man who has never needed to rush anywhere, because everywhere he needs to be has always waited for him. He was dressed in the kind of suit that doesn't announce itself. He settled into the chair across from Daniel's desk, declined coffee, and looked at Daniel with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely not going to soften what it had come to say. "I heard about Tuesday evening," Richard said. "It was an uncomfortable situation," Daniel said. "I imagine it was. I'm not here about the social dimension of it, Daniel. I'm here because I received something yesterday that I think you need to know about." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope, standard letter size. Already opened, he set it on the desk between them. "This came to my home address, no return address. The contents are a partial summary of Whitmore Capital's shareholder structure." Daniel looked at the envelope without touching it. "What do you mean, partial summary?" "I mean, someone sent me a document that outlines the beneficial ownership positions in this company in a level of detail that should not be available outside of the firm's legal records." Richard's voice remained entirely steady. "Specifically, it identifies a majority beneficial ownership position held through a trust that is not reflected in any materials I have been given as a board member." The room was very quiet. "Who sent it?" Daniel asked. His voice was also steady. He was good at steady. "I don't know. But I have a suspicion about why." Richard looked at him with the patience of a man who has watched other people make avoidable mistakes for 50 years. "Daniel, is there something about the capital structure of this company that you haven't told the board?" Daniel said nothing, because if there is, Richard continued, with the gentle implacability of a glacier, "I would strongly encourage you to have that conversation with your attorney before you have it with me, and I would encourage you to have it soon. I'd also encourage you to have a conversation with your wife, Claire," Daniel said. Richard's tone changed in a way that was subtle and significant, a slight additional weight on her name. "Your wife's father was a close friend of mine for 30 years. Edward Ashworth was one of the finest corporate attorneys I've ever known, and one of the most careful. He didn't do things without reasons. He didn't structure things carelessly. He loved his daughter very much, and he was a man who expressed that love through precision." Daniel looked at Richard Hale across the desk and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the specific discomfort of being in a room with someone who knows more than you do and is choosing carefully how much to give you. You know what's in that trust, Daniel said. It was not quite an accusation. Richard didn't deny it. I know what Edward told me years ago, in general terms. He didn't share specifics. That wasn't his way. But he told me enough that when I read what came in that envelope yesterday, it wasn't entirely a surprise. He stood, with the unhurry he had arrived with. The question that concerns me is whether it's a surprise to you. Daniel didn't answer. Richard collected his envelope and walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. One more thing. The person who sent this, I don't think they sent it to help you. I think they sent it to destabilize a situation they're finding harder to control than they anticipated. He looked back at Daniel. Be careful about who is trying to inform you right now and what they're actually trying to do. Daniel sat at his desk for a long time after the door closed. He was 44 years old. He had spent 20 years being the smartest person in most of the rooms he entered, and he had gotten good enough at it that he had stopped checking whether that was actually still true. He was beginning to understand, in a way that arrived slowly and then all at once, that he might have made a fundamental error. Not a business error, not a strategic error, but the quieter, more expensive kind. The kind that doesn't show up in a quarterly report. The kind where you look at a person every day for 14 years and tell yourself you know them, when what you've actually done is stopped looking. He picked up his phone. He called Claire. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He listened to her recorded voice, calm, professional, slightly warm, and then he set the phone down without leaving a message because he didn't know what to say. He sat there for another moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in months. He went home in the middle of the afternoon. The apartment was quiet when he let himself in. It was 3 o'clock. The light was coming through the west windows in long, flat angles the way it did at this time of year. He stood in the entry for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence, and understood from it that Claire was not home. He walked through the apartment slowly, not searching for anything specific, or not admitting to himself that he was. He went through the living room, the kitchen, the study they had set up as a shared workspace that had never quite been used the way they had imagined. Everything was in its place. Everything was clean and orderly and carefully arranged, the way Claire arranged things, with a kind of quiet attentiveness to detail that he had stopped noticing years ago, and was noticing now with the particular sharpness of things seen clearly when it might be too late. On her desk in the study, there was a notepad with some handwritten notes, a meeting agenda, a list of names, and a framed photograph of her father that had been on that desk since they had moved into this apartment. He looked at the photograph of Edward Ashworth for a moment. Edward in his 60s, silver-haired, standing on the lawn of the Connecticut house with that expression he always had, not quite smiling, but not withholding either. Just entirely and attentively present in the way Daniel had always found slightly uncomfortable, because it was the kind of presence that missed nothing and said nothing about what it noticed. Daniel had liked Edward. He had respected him. He had also, if he was being honest with himself in a way he rarely was, been slightly intimidated by him, not by his intelligence or his professional reputation, but by the quality of his attention when he looked at Daniel, like he was doing math and keeping the answer to himself. He had told himself in the months leading up to that bar on Tuesday night that his marriage was already over, that Claire had retreated so far into her own quiet life that there was nothing left to betray. He understood now that this had been a story he told himself, because the alternative required him to be wrong in ways he had not been prepared to be wrong. The alternative was that Claire was present and real and paying close attention and choosing, for her own reasons, not to fight. And that version of things demanded something from him that the other version did not. It demanded that he ask what he had done to make fighting feel, to her, like the wrong choice. He stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to. He thought about the photograph. He thought about the expression that missed nothing and said nothing about what it noticed. He understood, standing in the hallway of his own apartment on a Thursday afternoon in October, that Edward Ashworth had seen this coming, that the man had built an architecture not out of distrust of Daniel, but out of love for his daughter, and that there was a difference between those two things that Daniel was only now equipped to feel. He went to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the same window where Claire had stood 2 mornings ago. Looking out at the park, he pulled out his phone. He did not call Vanessa. He stood there for a moment, aware that calling Vanessa was the thing he would have done automatically 3 days ago, and equally aware that something had shifted in a way he could not yet name, that made that automatic reach feel, for the first time, wrong, not strategically wrong, morally wrong. The distinction felt important, though he had not quite arrived at why. He called Claire again instead. Again, 4 rings, again, voicemail. This time he left a message. Claire, I'm at the apartment. I'd like to talk to you when you're ready. I know I don't have a lot of standing to ask for that. I'm asking anyway. I'm sorry about Tuesday night. I should have. I'll be here for a while. He hung up, set the phone on the counter, face up, and waited. She did not call back. He was still there at 6 o'clock when his phone rang. Not Claire, his attorney, Gerald Foss, who did not call at 6 in the evening unless something had moved. We've received a counterfiling from Webb, Ashworth and Associates, Gerald said. It's a response to the challenge filed on behalf of Ms. Cole. It's thorough, Daniel. Very thorough. There's a disclosure exhibit attached. Documentation of a trust structure in your wife's name. I need you to look at some numbers. Daniel stood in the kitchen of his own apartment and listened to his attorney read him the terms of a trust his wife's father had established 8 years ago, and he understood, in real time, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, exactly what he had been given at the time of his marriage, and exactly what he had not read carefully enough to understand: the majority beneficial ownership of Whitmore Capital, in Claire's name. For 8 years, he set the glass of water down very carefully on the counter. Why didn't I know this? He asked. The documentation was served to this office at the time of the wedding, Gerald said, and his voice had the careful neutrality of a man choosing words with precision. It's in our records. It appears this was reviewed at the time as a standard prenuptial trust arrangement. The majority ownership position was disclosed in the exhibit. It appears it was not flagged as significant. I owe you a conversation about that. Yes, Daniel said. You do. He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. He thought about Richard Hale's face across the desk that morning. He thought about the envelope with no return address, and what Richard had said about who sent it and why. He thought about Vanessa in the hotel suite and the particular sequence of events that had led from there to here, and he began, slowly, with the resistance of a person who has built an identity on not being wrong, to follow the thread backward. Vanessa had encouraged him to keep the relationship quiet. Vanessa had shown particular interest in his calendar, his board schedules, his strategic planning sessions. Vanessa had been the one to suggest, 6 months ago, that the company might benefit from bringing in outside investors for the subsidiary restructuring, a suggestion he had found reasonable at the time and had acted on in small ways and had not thought about since. He thought about Richard Hale saying, "Be careful about who is trying to inform you right now and what they're actually trying to do." He thought about an envelope with no return address. sent to a board member's home address, containing information about a trust that should not have been available outside sealed legal records. Vanessa had sent it. He didn't have proof yet. He didn't need proof yet. He needed to think. And he was finally, after 2 days of calling a phone that didn't answer, actually thinking. He was thinking about the wrong he had done. Clearly, without the defensive architecture he usually constructed around his own mistakes. He had been having an affair for 14 months. He had stood at a bar on Tuesday night and watched a woman drop $1 at his wife's feet, and he had not moved. He was prepared now. He picked up his phone and called Claire one more time. When it went to voicemail again, he stood there in the quiet kitchen and felt the full weight of what 4 unanswered calls actually meant. Not that she wasn't there, but that she was there, and she was choosing, and she had been choosing for a long time. With more information than he had, and more patience than he deserved, on his way out through the study, he stopped again at the photograph of Edward Ashworth. "All right," he said quietly, to no one in the room. "I see it now." He turned off the light and left. Chapter 4 seconds later. The thing about a mechanism built with real precision is that when it activates, it doesn't announce itself. There is no dramatic sound, no visible movement, no moment where the room shifts and everyone knows something has changed. It just works, the way a well-made lock works, or a legal clause drafted by a careful man over the course of 18 months, with his daughter's future in mind and his own mortality beginning to make itself felt in the mornings. At 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, Marcus Webb's thumb moved once across his phone screen, in a rooftop elevator bank 43 floors above Midtown Manhattan, and a document that had been prepared, reviewed, revised, and held in readiness for 8 months was transmitted to the courthouse filing system. The affidavit was 11 pages. It documented, with timestamps and witness verification, and the exhaustive specificity that Marcus brought to everything he built, a pattern of conduct that crossed the threshold defined in Section 14, Paragraph C of the Whitmore Capital Shareholder Agreement, a clause that Edward Ashworth had insisted on including, over the mild objections of 2 other attorneys involved in the drafting, on the grounds that a majority ownership position held by a spouse required specific protections that standard corporate documents did not provide. The other attorneys had found it unusual. Edward had found it necessary. He had been right, as he generally was about things he found necessary. The filing hit the courthouse system at 9:47 p.m. The automatic enforcement mechanism attached to it activated at 9:48. The freeze on the relevant accounts, which had been pre-authorized through a separate court order obtained 6 weeks earlier in a sealed proceeding, executed at 9:49. At 9:52 p.m., Vanessa Cole's phone rang. She was standing near the east railing of the rooftop, in the spot where Claire had been standing 40 minutes earlier, in a small cluster of people that included 2 men from the financial world who found her very engaging, and a woman from the Whitmore Capital PR department who found her considerably less so. She had watched Claire leave with the particular satisfaction of someone who has executed a plan and is waiting for the results to confirm what she already knows. She had felt good. She had felt, in the specific way she felt best, in control. Her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She excused herself with a smile and stepped away from the group. The voice on the other end was clipped. Professional, entirely without warmth. "This is calling from First National Private Banking. I'm reaching you regarding account number ending in 7742. There's been a hold placed on the account effective this evening by court order." Vanessa stopped walking. "I'm sorry. A hold. A freeze, yes, court ordered. Effective 9:49 this evening." That's not possible, Vanessa said. Her voice remained even. She was good at even. There must be an error. There's no error, Miss Cole. The order is attached to a legal proceeding filed this evening. She ended the call. She stood very still for a moment, looking out at the city with the expression of someone doing rapid internal calculation. The account that had just been frozen was the one connected to the consulting retainer she had been receiving from a Whitmore Capital subsidiary for the past 14 months. The retainer that Preston Hall had assured her was structured in a way that made it invisible within the company's standard financial reporting. The retainer that she had come to think of as simply a part of her income. The way you stop thinking about the mechanisms of something once it becomes routine. She called Preston. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting. "I just got a call from the bank," she said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not panic, but the controlled tightness of a man managing something that has moved faster than he planned. "The account freeze is connected to a court filing. Tonight, someone filed an affidavit that triggered the shareholder clause." "Claire," Vanessa said. Not a question. It had to be. "The filing references the spousal conduct threshold in the shareholder agreement." "Vanessa, the subsidiary accounts are now part of an active legal proceeding. That means the compliance review will surface every transaction, every payment to you, every transfer." "You told me the payments were buried," she said. "They were buried in the normal course of financial reporting. A compliance review in an active legal proceeding is not the normal course. This is different. This is deliberate. She built this to surface exactly that." Vanessa turned away from the railing and looked back at the party. The lights, the linen-covered tables, the Manhattan skyline, performing its endless glamour behind it all. She looked at the place near the elevator where Claire had been standing, where she had delivered what she thought was the final word in a conversation she had been having for 14 months. She thought about the expression on Claire's face. Not humiliated, not crumbling, not any of the things a woman in that position was supposed to look like. She had looked like someone who had already moved on to the next thing. "She planned this tonight specifically," Vanessa said. "She was waiting for me to do something in public." Preston did not soften it. "She needed the public incident to clear the affidavit threshold. She needed you to give it to her, and I did." Silence on his end. "I'm working on that," Preston said. "But Vanessa, the subsidiary positions we've been building, the acquisition strategy, the restructuring play, all of it runs through accounts that are now visible in this proceeding. If this goes into open litigation, Crestfield's entire position becomes a matter of public record." "You're saying we need to settle," Vanessa said. "I'm saying we need to think very carefully about our next move before we make it. Don't do anything tonight. Don't call Daniel. Don't call anyone. Go home and let me work the legal angle." She ended the call. She stood at the edge of the party for another minute, the noise of it moving around her. She was going to follow most of Preston's advice. She was not going to follow the part about not calling Daniel. Daniel was in the back of a car heading downtown when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. He answered it, not because he wanted to talk to her, and not because he thought it would be a good conversation, but because 14 months of a habit is 14 months of a habit, and because some part of him answered before the smarter part could catch up. Her voice was controlled, and he could hear immediately, under the control, something he hadn't heard from her before. She was not a woman who scared easily. She was scared now. "What is it?" he said. "I need to tell you something. About Claire. About what Claire has been doing while you weren't paying attention." He looked out the car window at the city, moving past. "I'm listening," he said. "She's the majority shareholder of your company. Through a trust." Her father set it up before you were married and she never told you. The filing tonight, the account freeze, it's all connected to that trust. She's been planning this, Daniel. She set up the whole situation tonight so that I would give her the public incident she needed to trigger the clause. She used both of us. Daniel did not say anything for a long moment. The car moved through the city. Outside the window, the streets slid past, lit storefronts, yellow cabs, the particular busyness of a Manhattan evening that has no interest in the private catastrophes moving through it. Daniel, Vanessa said, are you? I know about the trust, he said. A silence on her end that was different from the silences before it. My attorney told me yesterday. He kept his voice flat, not angry. He was past the point where anger was the useful thing. What I'm still working out is why you sent that document to Richard Hale's home address. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. I don't know what your... The envelope, he said. No return address. Partial summary of the shareholder structure. Richard brought it to me Thursday morning. The only people who had access to that information before the freeze were the ones already inside the subsidiary records. You've been inside those records for a year, Vanessa. You and Preston Hall and Crestfield Partners, and in it, Daniel felt the last of something give way. Some remaining structure he had been, without fully admitting it, still leaning on. The version of the story where he had made a mistake. A significant and damaging mistake, but one that existed in a separate category from genuine betrayal. That version required Vanessa to have been, at bottom, what she had appeared to be. A woman he'd had an affair with, a situation he'd let go too far. A mess of his own making that was personal and damaging, and ultimately about his own failures. This was not that version. You've been feeding information to Crestfield for a year, he said. The calendar access, the planning sessions, the subsidiary restructuring suggestion 6 months ago. He said it without heat because the heat had gone somewhere else. Inward, toward himself. Toward the part of him that had not paid enough attention to see what was in front of him. The affair was access. I'm not angry at you, he said. This surprised him as he said it. But it was true. I'm angry at myself. There's a difference. Don't call me again tonight. He ended the call. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked out the window and sat with the full weight of what he now understood. He thought about Claire in the study, at her desk, the careful handwriting on the notepad. He thought about the photograph of her father. He thought about 14 years of a woman who was precise and attentive and never needed a raised voice to make herself felt, and he thought about how he had looked at all of that and seen stability. When what he should have seen was a full, complicated, specific person who had been making deliberate choices all along, including, it was now clear, the choice to wait. He thought about why she had waited. He had been circling this question for 2 days, and he was beginning, finally, to land on an answer that was neither flattering to himself nor simple enough to be a comfortable story. She had waited because she had loved him. Not in a passive way, not in a way that lacked self-respect. The legal architecture she had built made clear that she had never been without options. She had waited because some part of her had not wanted to use those options, because she had believed, or had needed to believe, that the marriage was not yet past the point of return. He had been the one to take it past that point, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments where he had chosen not to come home, not to look clearly, not to ask the questions that were sitting in plain sight waiting to be asked. He had been so certain that his understanding of the situation was complete that he had stopped checking whether it was actually true. It was the same mistake he had made with the trust documents 8 years ago. He had looked at something complex and assumed he understood it without reading it carefully enough. He had done that to Claire. He had treated her the way he had treated those documents, as something to be filed and assumed, not as something to be read. He had not said it out loud before, not to anyone, not even to himself. But standing in the kitchen of an apartment he had chosen and paid for and lived in for 6 years, he understood that he had been performing the role of a man who was present rather than being one. And performance, when it goes on long enough, starts to look like the real thing, even to the performer. That was the part that disturbed him most. Not that he had done it, but that he had done it so thoroughly he had stopped knowing he was doing it. The car pulled up to his building. He did not get out immediately. He sat for another moment in the back seat, in the city dark, in the specific loneliness of a person who has understood something too late and is not yet sure how too late it is. Then his phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Webb's number, which was unexpected, because Marcus did not text as a rule. It was 4 words: "She is ready to talk." Daniel stared at the message for a long moment. Then he got out of the car. Claire was in the kitchen of the apartment when she heard the key in the lock. She had come home an hour ago, made tea she hadn't touched, and sat at the kitchen table with the day's legal correspondence spread in front of her. Not reading it, looking at it without seeing it, thinking about the text she had asked Marcus to send. She had not been sure, right up until she asked him to send it, that she was going to. She heard Daniel come in. She heard him stop in the entry the way he always stopped, a beat of stillness, taking in the room, a habit she had always assumed was unconscious, and now wondered about. She heard him come through the hallway, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, still in his coat, looking at her across the room with an expression she had not seen on his face in a very long time. It was not guilt exactly. Though guilt was part of it, it was not remorse, though that was there too. It was something underneath those things, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the expression of a person who has stopped managing themselves for the moment and is just present, just there. She had forgotten what that looked like on him. "Sit down," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. He put his coat on the back of the chair, which was what he always did, the small automatic habit of a man who had sat in that kitchen thousands of times. She watched him do it, and felt the strangeness of how normal it looked against the context of everything that surrounded it. "I know about the shareholder structure," he said. "Gerald told me yesterday, and I know, I know, because Marcus will have told you." "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, then at her. "Not about the company, not about the legal situation. Why didn't you tell me? About the trust. About what your father built for you. Any of it." Claire looked at him steadily. She had thought about how she would answer this question, because she had known it was coming, and she had rehearsed several versions of the answer, and she had discarded all of them in the last hour, because none of them were quite true enough. "Because I wanted you to see me without it," she said. "I wanted to be your wife, not your majority shareholder. I wanted what we had to be real on its own terms, not propped up by something structural. My father understood that, which is why he never told you himself. He set it up as a protection, not a power play. I never wanted to use it as a power play, but you did use it," Daniel said. Not accusatory, just precise. She did not look away. "Because you gave me a reason to, and because Vanessa gave me a threshold on Tuesday night that made it legally executable, and because I had a text I wrote you a month ago that I didn't send, and I needed to know whether or not sending it was the right choice, and Tuesday night answered that question." Daniel went very still. What did the text say? She looked at him across the kitchen table. In the apartment that had always been slightly too cold and slightly too correct. In the city that had been moving around both of them for 14 years, while they had slowly, without either of them deciding to, moved away from each other, it said that I still wanted you to choose me, she said, that I would close down everything Marcus had been building if you came home that night. She kept her voice even. But it cost more than it had cost earlier in the day. I deleted it at 11:15 because you hadn't come home, and I understood that the answer was in the not coming. The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel looked at her with the expression of a man receiving information about himself that he is not able to immediately metabolize, too accurate to dispute, too painful to absorb quickly. His jaw moved once. Then he controlled it, and he was quiet for long enough that the silence took on its own weight. I didn't come home, he said finally. I wasn't choosing to not come, and in stopping he heard himself. He looked down at his hands. That's not better, is it? No, she said gently. It's actually worse. He nodded slowly. He looked up at her, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she felt that he was actually seeing her. Not managing the situation, not calculating the next move, but looking at her the way you look at something you are afraid of losing because you have just understood that losing it is a real possibility. What happens now? He asked. Now, she said, we have a very complicated few weeks. There are legal proceedings and board implications, and a corporate acquisition play that Vanessa has been running with a firm called Crestfield, which your attorney is going to want to talk to you about at length. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, we're going to have to figure out what we are, what we actually are. Not what we've been telling ourselves we are. And you don't know the answer to that yet. I don't know the answer to that yet, she confirmed. He sat with it. He did not push, did not fill the space with reassurance or request, or the kind of managed optimism that had always been his first defense against uncertainty. He just sat with it, which was, she thought, the most honest thing she had seen him do in 2 years. Her phone buzzed on the table between them. She looked at it. A message that read simply, Crestfield's attorney called. They want to talk about a settlement. Call me in the morning. She turned the phone face down. Go home, Daniel, she said, not coldly, just clearly, not to the hotel. Go to your apartment. Call Gerald. Use the guest suite there, or the club, wherever. She looked at him steadily. Not here. Not tonight. He stood. He picked up his coat. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the act of leaving, and she understood that he was doing what she had always wanted him to do, actually looking, actually seeing, actually registering what was in front of him. It was 6 years too late, and it was real, and both of those things were equally true. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. I know, she said. She heard the key in the lock again, in reverse this time. Then the click of it closing. Then the particular silence of an apartment where someone has just left who used to live there. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The city moved outside the window. The tea was completely cold. Her phone buzzed again. A financial publication. A breaking item. Crestfield Partners under compliance review, following Whitmore Capital legal proceedings. Sources indicate subsidiary account freeze, triggered disclosure of acquisition strategy. She read it once. Set the phone face down again. She thought about her father, in his kitchen in Connecticut, the night after she told him about the engagement, saying, I want you to have love and security separately, so that losing one never means losing the other. She had the security. She had built on top of what he left her, and she had protected it, and she had used it, in the end, the way he had always hoped she would not need to. The love part she was still figuring out. That, she thought, was going to take longer than a Tuesday evening in October. It was going to take the kind of honesty that doesn't have a mechanism or a clause, or a filing timestamp. It was going to take two people looking at each other clearly, without the buffer of assumptions, without the protection of knowing how it ends. She was not sure yet whether Daniel had it in him. She thought he might. She thought, carefully, without the excess of hope she had always been too willing to carry, that the man who had sat at her kitchen table tonight and listened without managing, who had heard himself mid-sentence and stopped, who had looked at her with something that was neither guilt nor calculation, but just genuine, uncalculated seeing. She thought that man might be capable of what came next. She did not know, and she was learning, slowly, that not knowing was not the same as being without ground to stand on. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Chapter 5. The Price of Silence Paid in Full. The offices of Webb, Ashworth and Associates occupied the northeast corner of the 42nd floor, and on a Friday morning in late October the light came in from that direction, cold and clear and very bright, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more defined than usual, edges sharpened, shadows precise. Claire had always liked that light. Her father had chosen this corner deliberately. He had said once that good legal work required good light, that you could not read a document clearly in a room that was trying to hide something. She arrived at 8:15. Marcus was already there, as he always was, coffee already made, a legal pad already covered in his small, dense handwriting. He looked up when she came in, and gave her the particular look he reserved for mornings, when things were about to be complicated. Vanessa's attorney called again last night, he said. They want to move the settlement conversation to this morning, in person. Claire set her coat on the chair and sat down. They asked for neutral ground. I suggested here. They accepted. Vanessa will be present. Her attorney made that a condition. Fine, Claire said. Daniel's attorney also called. Gerald Foss. Daniel wants to be here as well. Also fine, Claire said. Marcus studied her for a moment. You anticipated this. I anticipated that everyone would want to be in the same room eventually. Better to have it happen here, where we control the environment, than somewhere else. She reached for the coffee. What's Vanessa's settlement position? She wants the clause deactivated, the account freeze lifted, and a mutual, non-disclosure agreement that covers the full scope of the Crestfield connection. Marcus said this with the careful neutrality he applied to positions he found professionally unimpressive. In exchange, she and her attorney are offering a full withdrawal of the procedural challenge. She wants me to undo everything in exchange for her dropping a legal argument that isn't going to work anyway. Preston Hall has retained separate counsel. He's not coming this morning. His attorney sent a letter indicating Crestfield's willingness to divest the subsidiary positions in exchange for the compliance review findings being sealed. He set the letter on the desk between them. They're more frightened than Vanessa is. The subsidiary acquisition strategy, if it becomes public record, creates regulatory exposure for the fund. Claire read the letter. It was 2 pages, very carefully worded, and amounted, stripped of its careful wording, to a request to make a problem disappear in exchange for going away quietly. We're not sealing the compliance findings, she said. No, Marcus agreed. We're not. She set the letter down. What's our actual position going into this morning? Marcus turned his legal pad to face her. He had laid it out clearly. The leverage points, the exposure on each side, the range of outcomes. She read through it the way he had taught her to read legal documents, the way her father had taught him, slowly, completely, without deciding what you thought until you had finished. When she was done, she set the pad down and looked at him. We're stronger than they know, considerably, he said. The procedural challenge was their best argument, and it's not strong enough to survive the disclosure exhibit. The Crestfield connection, once it's visible in the compliance record, makes Vanessa's position in any counter-litigation essentially untenable. She's not just a party to a domestic dispute. She's a participant in what a creative prosecutor might characterize as corporate espionage. I don't think it will come to prosecution. But the threat of that framing is real, and her attorney knows it, so she needs this settlement more than I do. Yes, what she needs to understand is that you know that. He looked at her over his reading glasses. Are you prepared for this morning to be unpleasant? I've been prepared for unpleasant for 8 months, Claire said. The first to arrive at 9 o'clock exactly was Vanessa's attorney, a compact, precise man named Arthur Lee, who had the careful energy of someone very good at his job and very aware of the situation he was walking into. He shook Marcus's hand, acknowledged Claire with a nod that was professionally correct and nothing more, and settled into the chair on the far side of the conference table with his briefcase open and his expression arranged into neutral competence. Vanessa came in 30 seconds behind him. She looked like a woman who had not slept particularly well, but had done everything in her power to make sure that wasn't visible. She was dressed with the same care she always brought to her appearance, not aggressive, not performative, just precise. She met Claire's eyes when she came in, and Claire held the look, and something passed between them that was not hostility exactly, but was not anything softer than that. The recognition of two people who have been circling the same situation from opposite sides and have finally ended up in the same room. Vanessa sat next to her attorney without speaking. Gerald Foss arrived at 9:10 with Daniel 2 steps behind him. Gerald was a large man with the slightly rumpled authority of someone who has been in enough rooms like this one to have stopped being impressed by them. He set his briefcase on the table and began extracting documents with the efficiency of a man who wants to establish from the outset that he is here to work. Daniel came in and looked at Claire first. Not at Marcus, not at the room, not at Vanessa. She met his eyes briefly and looked away. Back at the documents in front of her, he sat across the table, 1 seat down from Vanessa, and did not look at her at all. Marcus opened the meeting with the particular calm authority he brought to proceedings like this. Not warm, not aggressive, just orderly. He outlined the legal posture of each party, the status of the active filings, the scope of what the morning's conversation was intended to address. He did this for approximately 6 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, Arthur Lee put his hand flat on the table, in the way of a man who has been waiting for an opening. My client's position, Arthur said, is straightforward. The clause activation was procedurally improper because the underlying ownership interest was not properly disclosed within the marriage. The affidavit was filed pursuant to a plan that used a manufactured public incident as its triggering mechanism. We are prepared to argue that this constitutes an abuse of the shareholder agreement's protective intent. He said all of this very cleanly. It was a good presentation of a weak argument, which was, Claire supposed, exactly what you wanted from an attorney. Marcus began to respond, but Claire put her hand lightly on his arm. May I? She said. Marcus sat back. Claire looked at Arthur Lee across the table. Then she looked at Vanessa. I want to address the procedural argument directly, she said. Her voice was even and unhurried, the way her father's voice had always been even and unhurried when he was about to say something important. The ownership interest was disclosed. It was disclosed in the trust documentation served to Daniel's attorneys at the time of our marriage, 8 years ago. The documentation is in Gerald's files, though I understand it may not have been reviewed as carefully as it should have been. The disclosure was real, and it was legal, and it satisfies every requirement of the shareholder agreement. She let that sit. What I want to address more directly is the characterization of Tuesday evening as a manufactured incident. She looked at Vanessa steadily. You walked across a room full of people and dropped $1 at my feet. You said what you said, loudly enough for 2 tables to hear. That was your choice, made freely, in public, in front of witnesses. I didn't manufacture it. I was ready for it. There's a difference. Arthur Lee looked at his notepad. He did not write anything on it. He just looked at it. The affidavit threshold required a public act of spousal interference in a professional setting, Claire continued. You provided it. The mechanism then did what mechanisms do when their conditions are met. It activated. That is not an abuse of the agreement's intent. That is the agreement's intent, exactly as my father designed it and exactly as it was meant to function. Your procedural argument is not going to survive the disclosure exhibit, Mr. Lee. I think you know that. The room was quiet. What my client is prepared to offer, Claire said, is a structured resolution that allows all parties to exit this situation without the compliance review findings entering public record. She slid a document across the table. Full withdrawal of the procedural challenge. Full divestiture of the Crestfield subsidiary positions, transferred at fair market value within 60 days. A cooperation agreement in which Vanessa provides a complete accounting of the information shared with Preston Hall over the past 14 months. In exchange, we do not pursue the corporate espionage framing with the relevant regulatory bodies, and the compliance findings remain within the sealed legal proceeding. She folded her hands on the table. That's what I'm offering. It's a better deal than what a courtroom would give you. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Vanessa leaned forward. You planned all of this, she said. Not to Arthur, not to the room, directly, personally, with a heat underneath it that her attorney immediately put a hand on her arm about. She ignored him. You spent months building a trap, and you waited for me to walk into it. You used me to get what you wanted. I built a legal protection, Claire said. You walked into it of your own free will. You needed me to, Vanessa said. Her voice had the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting to say something and is no longer willing to wait. You needed me to give you the public innocent. Without that, the clause doesn't activate. So you waited and you watched and you let it go on. The affair. Everything. Because you needed the incident more than you needed the marriage. The room was very still. Claire looked at her. She felt something that was not quite anger. Anger would have been easier. It was something more layered, more specific. She thought about 14 months. She thought about the things she had known and the things she had chosen to wait on. She thought about the texts she had written and deleted, the phone calls Daniel had not made, the evenings she had spent in the apartment that was slightly too cold and slightly too correct, maintaining a patience that had cost her more than anyone in this room was likely to understand. I waited, she said, because I was hoping I was wrong. About all of it. About him, about you, about what the marriage had become. I built the protection because my father taught me to be prepared. I waited to use it because I'm not someone who acts before she has to. Her voice stayed even. But it carried something in it now, not heat. Weight and yes. I needed the threshold to be met, but I didn't manufacture what you were. You were already what you were. You had already been taking meetings with Preston Hall for a year. You had already made the choice to use a man's marriage as a business strategy. I didn't create any of that. I just made sure that when it surfaced, I was ready. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in the hour since she had walked into the room, something in her expression shifted. Not softened, not conceited, like a person who has been holding a position and has just privately acknowledged, to themselves only, that the ground under it is not what they thought. She looked down at her hands on the table, the carefully manicured hands of a woman who had walked into a room 14 months ago, thinking she understood exactly how much power she was dealing with, and had been wrong from the first day. Her attorney spoke quietly to her. She listened. She gave a small nod. "We'll need time to review the terms," Arthur said. "Of course," Marcus said. "We'll step out." The hallway outside the conference room was narrow and bright, the same cold October light coming through the windows at the end. Claire stood at the window and looked out at the city. Marcus stood nearby, giving her space, doing what he always did in the waiting periods of difficult proceedings, being present without crowding. Behind her, she heard the conference room door open. It was Daniel. He closed the door behind him and came to stand beside her at the window, a professional distance, respectful of what the morning had required of both of them. He looked out at the city for a moment before he spoke. "You were extraordinary in there," he said quietly. She did not answer immediately. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said Thursday night, about the text, about coming home. I know it's not the moment for this, and I know I don't have the standing to." He stopped himself. He caught himself mid-management and let the management go. "I just want to say one thing, and then I'll go back in there and be quiet." She turned to look at him. "I understand now what I was doing," he said. "Not managing you. Actually doing it to you. Looking at you every day and deciding I understood what I saw without actually looking." He met her eyes. "I didn't read the trust documents 8 years ago because I looked at them and thought I already knew what they were. I did the same thing to you, for years, and I'm not asking you to forgive that right now or make any decisions about it. I just want you to know that I see it, that I actually see it." She looked at him in the bright October light, the man at the bar who didn't move, and the man in the hallway who was standing very still in an entirely different way. Not with the stillness of someone who has decided not to act, but with the stillness of someone who has decided to be honest. "What did you think the trust documents were?" she asked. "A formality," he said. "Rich family protecting their daughter. I thought I understood it, and I filed it away, the same way I thought I understood you and filed you away. And you were the majority shareholder of everything. You were the whole time." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know why my father structured it that way? Not just the protection piece, the specific majority position. He told me the night before the wedding. He said that he had watched Daniel Whitmore build something remarkable from nothing, and that he admired it genuinely. But he said that men who build from nothing sometimes forget later that the things worth keeping are not always the things you built. Sometimes they're the things you were given." He wanted to make sure that if you ever forgot that, there was a structure in place that would remind you. Daniel was quiet. The hallway was quiet around them, the city moving outside the window. "He was right," Daniel said. "He usually was," she said. The conference room door opened. Arthur Lee's head appeared. He looked at them with the expression of an attorney who has just finished reviewing a document and has something to report. "Ms. Whitmore, we're ready to continue." The settlement was agreed in principle by 11:30. Vanessa signed the cooperation agreement without speaking. She reviewed each page with the focused attention of someone making certain she understood exactly what she was agreeing to, which Claire respected. Even under the circumstances, Arthur Lee walked her through the terms with quiet professionalism. When she signed the final page, she set the pen down and looked across the table at Claire one last time. "For what it's worth," Vanessa said. Her voice had lost the controlled edge it had carried all morning. Something more stripped down underneath it now, something that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to honesty. "I underestimated you, completely." Claire looked at her steadily. I know, she said, not unkindly, just as a fact. Vanessa gathered her things and left with Arthur. The door closed behind them. She sat for a moment after Vanessa left, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting in the particular stillness of a room that has just finished being what it needed to be and is becoming something else. A conference room, again. Ordinary. Belonging to the regular business of the day. She thought about what her father used to say about endings, that they are only endings from one direction. From another direction, they are the moment the real work starts. She had spent 8 months preparing for a legal mechanism. The real work, she understood, sitting in that conference room with Marcus reviewing documents beside her, was only just beginning. It was going to be slower than a shareholder clause, less precise than a court filing, and considerably more uncertain. She was ready for that too. Gerald Foss began collecting his documents with the efficiency he had arrived with. He would need to have a separate conversation with Daniel about the shareholder situation and what it meant for the company's operational structure going forward. That was a conversation for another day, and everyone in the room understood that. Marcus was reviewing the signed pages, making sure everything was in order, which it was, because Marcus's documents were always in order. Daniel stood and put on his coat. He looked at Claire across the conference table, with the look she had seen in the hallway, clear, unmanaged, genuinely present. "Are you free for dinner?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, then she said. He accepted it without pushing. "Tomorrow?" he asked. She picked up her own coat. She thought about her father's kitchen in Connecticut, and what he had said about love and security, and about having them separately, so that losing one never meant losing the other. She thought about what it would mean to let love back in, not with the unchecked hope she had carried before. The hope that had made her wait too long, but with the clearer eyes of someone who has already used her protection and knows she can again if she has to. She thought about a man in a hallway who had caught himself mid-management and let the management go. "Maybe tomorrow," she said. It was not a promise. It was not a door closing. It was the specific, careful thing it was. A woman who knew her own ground, saying that she was willing to take one step at a time, and that was all she was willing to commit to right now, and that one step was not nothing. Daniel heard it for what it was. She could tell by the way something in his face settled, not relieved, not victorious, just quietly, genuinely present. "Okay," he said. 2 months later, on a Thursday morning in December, Claire Whitmore sat at the head of the Whitmore Capital Board table for the first time. The room was on the 39th floor, with windows on 3 sides, and a long table of polished wood that her father-in-law had chosen 30 years ago, because he believed that the surface you worked on said something about how seriously you took the work. She had always agreed with that, though she had never said so while she was in this room as a guest. She was not a guest today. Richard Hale was to her right, as he had been to her father's right in many rooms over many years, with the quiet solidity of a man who has been doing the right thing for so long that it has stopped requiring effort. Sandra Park was across the table, watching Claire with the particular expression of a woman who has known something was coming and is satisfied, in a measured way, to see it arrive. 3 other board members were present, and they had the look of people who had done their reading and arrived prepared, which was what Claire had requested when she sent the pre-meeting materials. The door opened at 9:01. Daniel came in. He crossed the room and took the chair to Claire's left. Not the chair he had occupied for 11 years, in the center of the long side of the table, but the one she had specifically left open, next to her, which meant something different about the structure of the room and the structure of the company and he had understood that when she had sent the seating arrangement the night before. He set his coffee down. He looked at the documents in front of him. "Ready?" she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked around the table, the city visible through the windows behind them, a company that bore a family name, and was now openly and officially structured the way it had always actually been structured, with Claire Whitmore as the majority beneficial owner and Daniel Whitmore as the chief executive, within a framework that was honest about what it was. It was not a romantic ending. It was not a triumphant ending in the way that stories sometimes allow themselves to be triumphant. It was something more durable than that, the kind of ending that arrives not with fanfare, but with the quiet, solid feeling of things being put in their right order after a long time of being arranged incorrectly. They had had dinner 3 times in the past 2 months. Not reconciliation dinners, not negotiation dinners, the two of them, in restaurants that were neither too casual nor too freighted with history. In the way they had talked in the early years, before the building and the managing and the not looking had taken over, she did not know where it was going. She was not trying to know yet. She was, for the first time in a long time, willing to be in the middle of a thing without having already decided how it ended. That, too, was something her father had tried to teach her. It had taken her longer to learn than the legal architecture. She opened the folder in front of her. "Let's start with the capital structure review," she said. The meeting began. Outside the windows, December Manhattan was doing what December Manhattan does, cold and bright and entirely indifferent to the private histories being made inside its buildings, moving with the particular restless energy of a city that doesn't stop to mark the moments that matter, because the moments that matter don't need marking. They just become the thing that happened, the thing that changed something. The before and after that a person carries quietly for the rest of their life. Claire Whitmore had spent 2 years being the wife nobody looked at twice. She had spent those same 2 years building something nobody knew about. And when the moment came, she had used what she had built not to destroy what she had, but to clear the ground of everything that had been obscuring it, the assumptions, the inattention, the comfortable stories that people tell themselves when looking clearly feels like too much to ask. What was left after the clearing was not exactly what she had hoped for when she was 31 and standing in a Connecticut garden saying, "I do," with her father watching from the 3rd row with that expression of his, careful, attentive, not quite smiling, but not withholding either. It was not the uncomplicated love story she had believed she was beginning, but it was real, and it was hers, and she had paid for it in the specific currency of someone who understands what things actually cost, not in suffering, not in victimhood, but in the patient, clear-eyed, deliberate way of a woman who had read every document, understood every clause, and chosen in the end to leave one door open, one step at a time. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. End of story.